Well, good evening to everybody. It's about 8 o'clock in the evening, and this video will be uploaded and will go live tomorrow around 10 a.m. I've noticed recently on Facebook and on other social media a number of memes and status updates, all that have to do with the Syrian refugee crisis. And the commonality, the thread that sort of ties them all together is that they're all coming from folks that would identify as either secularist or atheist, and they all have some sort of reference to Scripture or allusion to Scripture, basically attacking Christians for being inconsistent, for opposing the refugee settlement of Syrian refugees here in the United States. And the argument is really that Christians have a moral obligation in this regard to approve of the resettlement of these refugees here in the U.S. I don't really have any kind of argument to make either way or the other where the Syrian refugee settlement is concerned. That's not really what I'm aiming at in this video. I really want to respond to the arguments that I see being made. So my opinion about refugee resettlement is neither here nor there for the purpose of this video. So if that's what you're here to hear about, you're in the wrong place. What I find interesting is really the incoherence of the secularist and atheist memes and status updates that I'm seeing about this. I find it incoherent because these are the very people that have had absolutely no use for any sort of Christian moral or ethical obligations in the political sphere at other points. I mean, think of abortion and what our Roman friends have had to hear from years from this exact same crowd. Keep your rosaries off our ovaries. Or think of all of the insanity that's going on over Christian opposition to same-sex marriage, particularly in California with Proposition 8. What we were being told then is, well, if you want to live in a theocracy, move to Iran. But now, you've gotten what you wanted, which is for Christians to shut up, sit down, and not live consistent with their own Christianity in the public sphere. It's fine if you believe that God stuff at home, but don't talk about it outside of your house. Well, you got what you wanted, but now you want a Christian political ethic? Really? It seems to me like you only want Christians to behave like Christians in the socio-political sphere when it suits you for them to do so. But there's an even bigger question here that needs to be answered. What is the secularist or atheistic basis for their own moral ought? My question here is twofold. First, it's what right do you have as a secularist or one who denies the existence of God entirely to interpret Scripture to a Christian, telling and defining for them or to them what it is that their moral obligation is? You would be the very first to decry my interpreting the Quran or presenting to you verses from the Quran that advocate for violence. You would say, well, that's not real Islam. Well, who are you to be the arbiter of all religious truth? Furthermore, I should point out that Tertullian, the ancient church father, had something to say about this in his Prescription Against Heretics. Basically, his point was that the Bible belongs to Christians, not to anybody else, and those who attempt to use it have no right to do so. So, on what basis do you seek to interpret Scripture to anyone, much less to a Christian? Furthermore, you need to demonstrate to me that you can even formulate an entirely secular, wholly non-religious basis for moral obligations. To my knowledge, the only person that I know of in the secularist or atheistic sphere that's attempted to do that was George Smith, and his argument collapsed. You see, he tried to formulate his argument based on Ayn Rand's objectivist ethics, but he began his book, Atheism, the Case Against God, where he tried to make this ethical argument by saying that it is incoherent to speak of anything immaterial. Yet, at the end of his book, he wants to speak of moral laws. I'd like to ask, Mr. Smith, are laws material? If they are, pick one up, bring it to my house, and show it to me. If they aren't, then your argument's failed. Michael Martin, who wrote Atheism: A Philosophical Justification, he didn't even attempt to build an entirely secular basis for moral obligation. So if you want to have this argument, by all means, let's do so, but you need to make a positive case for your own ethic. But what really burns me up is the even greater incoherence of the liberal Christian argument that I'm seeing put forward. Now, this is the group of people that was entirely opposed to laws against homosexual practice and homosexual marriage because those laws would be based in the Old Testament. But now you want a refugee policy based on the Old Testament stranger code. Do you remember all of your arguments about how those evil, wicked, inerrantist, conservative Christians were incoherent and inconsistent because they wanted to interpret Old Testament laws about homosexuality, but they didn't have a problem with eating shellfish or wearing blended cloth clothing? Are you even aware that the stranger code that you want to base our refugee policy on is found in the exact same passage of Scripture? It's Leviticus chapter 19. Specifically in this case, the stranger code is verses 33 to 34. Just a question for you, since you made those arguments in the past, and I saw many of you make them on Facebook. Does the shoe pinch now that it's on the other foot? But let me extend the argument regarding Leviticus 19, 33 and 34. And this is a question to both groups, both my liberal Christian friends and my secularist atheistic friends. If our refugee policy can be based on Leviticus 19, 33 to 34, then on that basis, the argument that you are making, why then can't our marriage policy be based on Leviticus chapter 20, verse 13? It's only a handful of sentences away. It's not enough for you to attempt to point out that we're being inconsistent when in fact we're not. As a matter of fact, I can make an entirely consistent argument for opposition to homosexual practice in marriage and not wearing blended, and being able, I should say, to wear blended cloth clothing, eat shellfish, and enjoy a lovely plate of Eastern North Carolina style barbecue. You need to recognize that what's sauce for the goose is sauce for the gander. So I want to put you in the position you've been putting us in for years. If you want to base our refugee policy on Old Testament law, you need to demonstrate to me why we can't base our marriage policy on it. In short, the arguments that I'm seeing are completely arbitrary, and I have been taught that arbitrariness and inconsistency is the hallmark of a failed argument. And what's worse is that you're presenting arguments that do more damage to your own position than they do to the position you're arguing against. To my Christian friends, I would simply say this: give arbitrary, inconsistent, incoherent arguments exactly the amount of attention they deserve. By my count, that's about 8 minutes and 30 seconds worth.